There are thresholds in your life that you do not recognize until you have already crossed them. They are not grand, arched doorways flanked by pillars, but simple, unmarked lines in the dust of an ordinary Tuesday. You step over them without a thought, and it is only when you look back that you see the deep, uncrossable chasm you have left behind. For me, that threshold was the worn, gray fabric of my sofa, and the moment I crossed it was marked by the weight of another person's unconscious trust, a warmth that threatened to burn through the careful architecture of my life. It was the moment Julian fell asleep with his head in my lap, and the entire world narrowed to the space between one of his breaths and the next. The room was a study in near darkness, a familiar landscape I usually found comforting. My apartment was small, a sanctuary I had curated with the precision of a photographer composing a shot. Every book on the shelf, every framed print on the wall, was a part of a quiet narrative I had constructed for myself. But tonight, that quiet was different. It was not empty, it was full. It was charged with a presence that was both achingly familiar and terrifyingly new. The only light came from the city outside my third-floor window, a muted orange and silver glow that painted soft, abstract shapes on the opposite wall, turning the familiar lines of my living room into something foreign and mutable. The television murmured on, its sound a low, electronic river that flowed beneath the more significant silence of the room, a silence built not of absence, but of held breaths and unspoken questions. Julian's breathing was the metronome of my anxiety. It was slow, deep, the rhythm of true sleep, of a body that had finally surrendered its tension to a place it deemed safe. And that was the problem, was it not? That place was me. His dark hair, still faintly damp from a shower hours earlier, was a soft weight against the denim of my jeans. I could feel the warmth of him through the fabric, a radiating heat that seemed to seep directly into my bones, bypassing skin and muscle to settle somewhere deep and vital. My own body was a statue carved from tension. I had not moved in what felt like hours, my muscles locked in a state of suspended animation, terrified that the slightest shift would break the spell, that he would wake up and the fragile, impossible reality of this moment would shatter into the million sharp-edged pieces of our normal friendship. My hand rested on the cushion beside his head, my fingers curled into a tight fist. I could feel the phantom sensation of his hair against my knuckles, and the urge to uncurl my fingers, to simply let them rest in that softness, was a physical ache. It was a gravitational pull, a magnetic force that took every ounce of my willpower to resist. To touch him like that, intentionally, would be to cross another line, a more deliberate and indefensible one. This, what was happening now, could be explained away. He was exhausted. He was grieving a different kind of loss. He had simply fallen asleep. It was an accident of proximity, a fluke of emotional exhaustion. But if I moved my hand, if I gave in to the desperate longing that was screaming through my veins, it would become an action, a choice. And I had spent years, nearly a decade, meticulously avoiding that choice. He made a small sound in his sleep, a soft sigh that feathered against my leg, and shifted slightly, pressing his face more firmly into the crook of my thigh. My breath hitched in my chest. The air suddenly felt too thick to draw, too heavy for my lungs. This was a new cartography of intimacy, a landscape for which I had no maps. For 8 years, our friendship had been a continent with clearly defined borders, with safe harbors and known territories. I was the quiet coast he returned to after his voyages into the turbulent oceans of his own life, his romances, his career. I was the steady, reliable landmass. But this was a tectonic shift. The old maps were useless now. The ground beneath us was moving, creating new mountains and new, terrifyingly deep valleys, and I was utterly, completely lost within it. The world had been one way when we sat down to watch this stupid movie, and now it was another. I was just beginning to understand the magnitude of the earthquake that had just occurred, silently, in the dim light of my living room. To understand the tremor, you have to understand the ground it shook. You have to go back to the blinding chlorine blue of a collegiate swimming pool, and the echoing cacophony of whistles and shouts that felt like the soundtrack to our youth. Julian and I met in the water, which in retrospect feels like a perfect metaphor for the foundation of our friendship. We were both swimmers, but of entirely different disciplines, different philosophies of motion. I was a distance swimmer, all quiet endurance and methodical rhythm. My world was the steady, hypnotic pull of water past my ears, the metronomic churn of my own arms, the black line on the bottom of the pool, my only guide. I found a meditative peace in the long, lonely pursuit of the final wall, a comfort in the predictable burn of my muscles. I was built for the long haul, for the quiet suffering that leads to a gradual, almost imperceptible victory. Julian was the opposite. He was a sprinter, a creature of explosive, violent power. He lived in the first 50 meters, in the chaotic churn of white water and the desperate, lung-searing gasp for air. His races were over in the time it took me to find my rhythm. He was all bright, kinetic energy on the pool deck, a whirlwind of easy laughter and casual, confident charm. He collected friends the way other people collected spare change, effortlessly and without much thought. He was the sun, and the rest of us were just planets caught in his orbit, happy to circle in his warmth. I remember watching him before a race, the way he would shake out his arms, a live wire crackling with potential energy, his eyes focused on the far wall with a terrifying intensity. And then the starting pistol would crack, and he would launch himself into the water like an arrow, a brief, beautiful explosion of purpose. Then it would be over, and he would emerge, gasping and grinning, the energy dissipating into that easy charm once more. Our friendship should not have worked. On paper, we were a study in contrasts, the quiet observer and the dazzling performer, the marathon and the sprint. But it did work from the very first day. We were assigned adjacent lanes for a warm-up, and he'd made some ridiculous joke about the questionable fashion choices of our coach. I remember offering a small, hesitant smile, and he'd beamed back, a full wattage, incandescent grin that felt like a reward. From then on, it was easy. We fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as the strokes we practiced for hours on end. We shared meals in the loud, clattering dining hall, studied in the hushed reverence of the library, and complained about the ungodly hour of morning practices. He drew me out of my shell, and I think, offered him a space of quiet that he did not find anywhere else. He never seemed to need to perform for me. With me, he could just be. The moment it changed for me, the moment the simple, sturdy architecture of friendship began to develop a hairline fracture of something more, was unremarkable to anyone else. It was after a mid-season meet, a miserable, rain-soaked affair in a natatorium that smelled of mildew and despair. We had both swum poorly. My times were sluggish, my rhythm off. Julian had false-started in his main event, a gut-wrenching disqualification. We were sitting on the cold tile of the locker room floor, wrapped in damp towels, the celebratory shouts of the winning team echoing from the pool deck. I was staring at my hands, tracing the lines on my palms, lost in my own quiet disappointment. Julian was uncharacteristically silent beside me, his head leaning back against the cool metal of a locker. Then, without a word, he nudged my shoulder with his. It was a simple gesture, a small point of contact in a moment of shared failure. I looked over at him. He was not looking at me, but staring up at the ceiling, his profile etched by the harsh fluorescent lights. A drop of water traced a path from his wet hair down his temple. And then he said, so quietly I almost did not hear it, "At least we sucked together." He turned his head then and gave me a small, tired smile. It was not his usual dazzling grin. It was something smaller, more genuine, and infinitely more devastating. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. The solid ground of our friendship gave way to a strange, liquid feeling, a warm current pulling me somewhere I had never intended to go. It was the first time I realized that the quiet space I offered him was not just a sanctuary for him, but a gilded cage for my own heart. I started building the walls that day. They were not built of anger or resentment, but of a quiet, desperate kind of love that sought only to preserve. The friendship was too important, too vital to my own existence, to risk on the foolish, selfish hope of something more. So I became an expert in emotional architecture. I built fortifications around my feelings, patrolled the borders of my own heart, and learned to live with the quiet ache of what could not be. I became the perfect friend. I listened to his stories about the girls he was dating, offering carefully neutral advice. I was his steadfast supporter, his reliable confidant, the one person who knew him without the gloss and performance he offered to the rest of the world. I watched him fall in love with Chloe. She was lovely, an art history major with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. They made sense together. They were both bright, shiny people. I went to their parties, ate dinners with them, and perfected the art of the happy, supportive smile. Inside, I was conducting a masterclass in self-deception, telling myself that this was enough, that their happiness was a worthy substitute for my own. I photographed their life together, an unofficial documentarian of their love story. I framed a perfect shot of them laughing in a pile of autumn leaves, the late afternoon sun turning their hair to gold, and felt a pang so sharp, so exquisitely painful, that I had to put the camera down and pretend to check my settings. I was developing a photograph of a life I would never be a part of, watching it emerge in the chemical bath of my own quiet longing, and learning to call that art. For years, this was our equilibrium. A careful, sometimes painful, balance. Julian would travel for his new consulting job, a career that suited his restless energy, and he would call me from sterile hotel rooms in cities whose names blurred together. He would tell me about his projects, about the frustrations and the small victories, and sometimes, in the late hours, he would talk about a deeper weariness, a sense of being unmoored that he could not quite articulate. I would listen, my own apartment a silent anchor on the other end of the line. I was the constant in his equation, the fixed point in his spinning world. And I thought that was our destiny, our permanent arrangement. I had accepted it. I had made my peace with the shape of my love for him, a love that was destined to live and die in the silent rooms of my own heart. I had no idea that the foundation of his own world was about to crack, and that when it did, he would come seeking refuge in mine. The catalyst, when it came, was not a sudden, violent explosion, but a slow, grinding collapse. His relationship with Chloe had been fraying for months, a fact he'd only alluded to in fragmented, late-night phone calls. He spoke of a growing distance, a sense of performing for each other that had become exhausting. He was on the road too much. She was building a life he was increasingly absent from. It was a death by 1,000 small cuts, a gradual erosion of the thing they had built together. The final break, he told me later, was quiet and horribly civil. A conversation over a cold dinner where they both finally admitted that the effort of pretending had become greater than the comfort of staying together. There was no shouting, no dramatic storming out, just a sad, resigned agreement that it was over. He showed up at my door 2 days later. It was late on a Thursday, a cold rain slicking the streets outside and tapping a restless rhythm against my window panes. I was in my small dark room, the red safe light casting an infernal glow over everything, watching an image of a deserted city street slowly emerge in the developer tray. There was a magic to it I never tired of, the alchemy of light and silver and time. The knock on my apartment door was hesitant at first, then more insistent. It was an unfamiliar sound. Julian never knocked. He had a key. He would just let himself in, his voice booming through the small space. "Leo, you home?" I dried my hands, my heart thudding with a strange premonition, and navigated the darkness of my apartment to the door. When I opened it, he was just standing there, soaked. The rain had plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and his expensive work coat was dark with moisture. But it was his face that stopped my breath. I had seen him tired, stressed, even angry. I had never seen him look so utterly hollowed out. His usual energy, that bright, crackling current that always surrounded him, was gone. He looked like a house with all the lights turned off, the windows dark and empty. He was just staring at me, his eyes wide and lost, as if he had traveled a great distance and was surprised to find himself on my doorstep. "Hey," he said, and his voice was a rough, broken thing. It was the sound of gravel under a heavy weight. "Julian? What's wrong? Get in here." I said, my own voice tight with alarm. I pulled him inside, shutting the door on the miserable night. He dripped onto the small welcome mat, not seeming to notice the puddle forming around his feet. He was holding a small duffel bag, clutching the strap so tightly his knuckles were white. "It's over," he said, looking not at me, but at a point on the wall somewhere over my shoulder. "Me and Chloe. It's done." I just nodded, a wave of complicated emotions washing over me. A pang of sympathy for his pain, a shameful, treacherous flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope, and an overwhelming urge to just make the lost look in his eyes go away. "I'm so sorry, man." I managed, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "It's okay," he said, though his expression said it was anything but. "It's for the best." We both knew it. He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes was not just heartbreak. It was something deeper, a profound exhaustion that seemed to emanate from his very soul. I couldn't be there tonight. In the apartment. It's so quiet. All her stuff is gone, and it's just so empty." He swallowed, his throat working. "Is it okay if can I crash on your couch tonight? I don't want to be alone." The question hung in the air between us, heavy and fragile. Of course, he could. He could always have anything he needed from me. But this felt different. He was not asking for a favor. He was asking for sanctuary. He was coming to me not as his friend, but as his harbor. "Of course," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "You never have to ask." A visible wave of relief washed over his features, his shoulders slumping as if a great weight had been lifted. He was letting me see the crack in his carefully constructed armor, a vulnerability he rarely showed to anyone. In that moment, standing in my small hallway, dripping rainwater onto my floor, the old, familiar lines of our friendship began to dissolve, blurring into something new and undefined. He had brought his shipwreck to my shore, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I would do anything to help him rebuild, even if it meant letting him use the pieces of my own heart for timber. That first night established the new language of our relationship, a dialect spoken not in words, but in proximity and shared silence. I gave him a dry t-shirt and a pair of old sweatpants, and he changed while I made him a cup of tea, my hands moving with an automatic, practiced calm that belied the storm raging inside me. He sat on the couch, wrapped in one of my blankets, and stared into the steam rising from the mug, not really speaking. He did not need to. The silence in my apartment was not the empty, echoing silence he had fled. It was a full silence, a space held and protected. We sat like that for a long time, the only sounds the ticking of the clock on the wall and the persistent drumming of the rain. When he finally lay down on the couch, he curled into himself, his back to the room. I lingered in the doorway of my bedroom, watching the rise and fall of his shoulders under the blanket. A powerful, protective instinct rose in me, so fierce it was almost painful. I wanted to smooth the hair back from his forehead, to tell him everything would be all right, to absorb his pain into myself. But I did not. I just stood there, a silent sentinel, until his breathing deepened into the slow, even rhythm of sleep. Then I went to my own bed, but I did not sleep for a very long time. I lay in the darkness, listening, as if I could somehow guard his rest from the other side of a wall. One night bled into the next, and the ritual began to form. He went back to his own apartment during the day to get clothes for work, to maintain the semblance of his own life, but his evenings and nights were spent at mine. It became our unspoken routine. He would arrive after work, shed his corporate skin along with his suit jacket, and we would fall into an easy, domestic pattern. We would cook dinner together or order takeout and eat while talking about our days. It was all so deceptively normal. We were just two friends, helping one of them through a hard time. That was the official story, the one we told ourselves and each other through our careful avoidance of the topic. But beneath the surface of that story, another one was being written. The physical space between us began to shrink, the invisible boundaries that had always existed slowly eroding. It started with small things. He would lean against my side while we were on the couch, his shoulder pressing against mine. He would leave his shoes by my door, his toothbrush in a cup on my bathroom sink. His presence began to permeate my space, his scent clinging to the cushions of the sofa, his coffee mug becoming a permanent fixture on my drying rack. My carefully curated sanctuary was no longer just mine. It was ours, and I found that I did not mind. In fact, I treasured every small sign of his encroachment, every piece of him that took root in my home. The couch became the main stage for this quiet drama. It was old and comfortable, a gray monolith that had seen me through years of solitary evenings. Now, it was our shared territory. We would watch movies, the glow of the screen illuminating our faces in the dark. The first time he fell asleep on me, it was almost accidental. We were watching some mindless action movie, and his head, which had been resting on the back of the sofa, simply tipped sideways to land on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. I sat there for the entire 2-hour runtime, my arm going numb, my neck cramping, not daring to move. He had just seemed so exhausted, and the sleep he found there felt fragile, sacred. I told myself I was just being a good friend, offering a small, physical comfort to someone who was hurting. It was a plausible, reasonable explanation. It was also a lie. The truth was, having him there, trusting me even in his sleep, felt like a quiet miracle, and I was terrified of disturbing it. This became part of the ritual. More often than not, he would drift off during our nightly movie. His head on my shoulder became a familiar weight. I learned the specific cadence of his sleep breathing, the way his eyelashes brushed against my neck when he shifted. I studied the lines of his face in the flickering light of the television, the slight furrow between his brows that would smooth out as he fell deeper into sleep. It was a dangerous, addictive kind of intimacy. It was a feast for a starving man, and I was gorging myself on these small, ambiguous gestures, all while pretending I was not hungry at all. My photography became an escape, but also a reflection of my inner state. I found myself drawn to liminal spaces, doorways, windows, the moment of twilight between day and night. I took a series of photos of reflections in puddles, the world upside down and shimmering, a perfect image that could be shattered by a single drop of rain. My darkroom was my confessional. In the red-tinged darkness, surrounded by the sharp, clean scent of chemicals, I could let the mask slip. I would watch his face emerge on the paper in the developer tray, a candid shot I had taken one afternoon when he was laughing at something I said, and I could admit the truth to myself. I was in love with him. I had been for years. And this strange, new chapter of our lives was both the sweetest torture and the most profound hope I had ever known. The ritual escalated on the night of the hook, the night that became the new benchmark for everything. It had been a particularly bad day for him. A project at work had blown up, and he had spent the day in tense meetings, absorbing blame that was not his to carry. He came to my apartment looking frayed and brittle, the exhaustion of the past few weeks finally catching up to him in a visible way. He barely spoke during dinner, just pushed food around his plate. When we settled onto the couch, he was restless, unable to get comfortable. He sighed, a sound of deep, bone-weary frustration, and then he did something new. He shifted, stretching his long legs out across the cushions, and then, without a word, he laid his head in my lap. And there it was, the threshold. My world tilted on its axis. His head on my shoulder was one thing. It was ambiguous, almost fraternal. This was different. This was an act of profound surrender, an implicit statement of trust and comfort that transcended the normal boundaries of our friendship. I could feel the frantic, rabbit-fast beat of my own heart, a wild drumming against my ribs. I was certain he must be able to hear it, to feel the vibration of my panic. But his eyes were closed, his face turned slightly towards my stomach. He was not asleep, not yet. He was just resting there, a stillness in his body that I had not seen in weeks. "Is this okay?" he murmured, his voice muffled by my shirt. The question was a lifeline. It was a chance for me to retreat, to reestablish the old boundaries, to say, "No, man, this is weird." It was the sensible thing to do, the self-protective thing to do. But the word died in my throat. All I could manage was a quiet, "Yeah, it's okay." And so I sat there, a living statue, as his breathing slowly deepened and evened out, until he was well and truly asleep. The weight of his head was both an anchor and a crushing burden. It was everything I had ever wanted and everything I was terrified to lose. I looked down at him, at the way his dark lashes rested against his cheek, at the relaxed line of his mouth, and I felt a love so vast and so painful it was like a physical presence in the room. I was living on a razor's edge, caught between the heaven of this stolen intimacy and the hell of knowing it could all be a misunderstanding, a mirage created by his grief and my hope. And as the city lights painted their shifting patterns on my wall, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I could not go back. I had crossed the line, and I had no idea what lay on the other side. Weeks melted into a month, and the ritual became our new normal. The couch was our island, a space governed by a different set of rules than the rest of the world. By day, we orbited each other in the familiar patterns of friendship. By night, we drifted into this quiet, physical intimacy that we never, ever acknowledged in the light of day. It was a fragile, unspoken agreement, a glass sculpture we were both carefully circling, neither of us willing to touch it for fear of shattering it. The ambiguity was a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of my days, an ache of uncertainty that I carried with me everywhere. I was a cartographer trying to map a coastline that shifted with every tide, and the effort was exhausting. Then came the night the tide turned. It was a quiet Saturday. We had spent the day in comfortable silence, me editing photos in my office alcove, him reading on the armchair, the only sounds the click of my mouse and the rustle of turning pages. There was a peaceful, domestic quality to it that felt both wonderful and dangerous. Later, we found ourselves on the couch, in our usual configuration. He was stretched out, his head resting in its now familiar place in my lap. A black and white foreign film was playing on the television, the soft cadence of a language neither of us understood filling the room. But tonight, something was different. He was not asleep. I knew from the tension in his body, a subtle rigidity that was not there when he was truly at rest. His eyes were open, staring at the screen but not, I suspected, actually seeing it. The air between us felt thick, charged with a static electricity I could almost feel on my skin. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was heavy with unspoken words, a dam holding back a flood of something I could not name. I kept my own eyes fixed on the screen, my heart beginning its frantic, familiar rhythm of anxiety. I could feel the moment stretching, pulling taut like a rubber band about to snap. He shifted, turning his head to look up at me. In the monochrome light from the television, his face was all shadows and angles, his expression unreadable. My breath caught, my entire being focused on him, waiting. The world outside the two of us, outside the small island of this couch, ceased to exist. Leo. His voice was quiet, a rough whisper that seemed impossibly loud in the silent room. It was the first time he had spoken in over an hour. I could not find my own voice. I just looked down at him, my throat tight. He held my gaze, and in his eyes, I saw a maelstrom of emotions I could not begin to decipher. There was confusion, yes, but there was also something else. Something vulnerable and questioning and intensely focused. He swallowed, a small, audible sound. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The dam was about to break. Would it be weird if I kissed you? The words were not a proposition. They were a confession. They were a question born of the same terrifying uncertainty that I had been living with for weeks. They were a key, offered to a door I had long ago bolted from the inside. My mind went completely blank, and then flooded with everything at once. Years of carefully suppressed longing, the terror of ruining the most important thing in my life, the desperate, overwhelming hope that this was real. All of it crashed over me in a single, silent wave. I could not speak. The words were trapped somewhere between my heart and my throat, a logjam of fear and desire. All I could do was give a small, jerky nod, a barely perceptible movement that felt like the most significant action of my entire life. It was all the answer he needed. He pushed himself up slightly, his hand coming up to rest on my jaw, his thumb stroking softly against my skin. The touch was electric, a spark that shot through my entire nervous system. He leaned in, his eyes never leaving mine, and then he closed the small distance between us. The kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was hesitant. It was gentle. It was a question asked again, this time without words. It was the taste of uncertainty and salt and of fragile, terrifying hope. It was the shattering of the glass sculpture, and I did not care about the pieces. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 8 years, I did not build a wall. I let him in. The aftermath of a tremor is often more disorienting than the earthquake itself. The world has been irrevocably altered, but it takes time for the mind to accept the new landscape. The morning after the kiss was defined by a profound and terrifying silence. I woke up alone. The couch was empty, the blanket folded neatly at one end. For a moment, a hazy, sleep-addled moment, I thought I might have dreamed it all. But then I saw his coffee mug, rinsed and sitting by the sink, a small, sterile piece of evidence that he had been here and was now gone. He had left without a sound, a ghost slipping out before sunrise. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text message from him. My heart leaped with a hopeful, foolish flutter. Morning. Had to get an early start on some work stuff. See you later. The words were a bucket of ice water. They were so normal, so utterly, devastatingly casual. There was no mention of the kiss, no acknowledgement of the seismic shift that had occurred between us just hours before. See you later. It was a phrase from our old life, the life before the threshold, and reading it felt like a repudiation of everything that had happened. I spent the day in a fog of anxiety, my phone a lead weight in my pocket. I jumped every time it buzzed, but it was never him. Later came and went. The sun set, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, and my apartment remained silent and empty. He did not come. The silence stretched into a second day, then a third. My texts to him went from casual, "Hey, you okay?" to concerned, "Julian, what's going on?" His replies, when they came at all, were brief, evasive, and maddeningly polite. Swamped with work, just tired, talk soon. Each message was a brick, and he was using them to rebuild the wall between us, a wall I had just, for one breathtaking moment, believed was gone for good. The hope that had bloomed in my chest after the kiss began to wither, curling in on itself, leaving behind the familiar, bitter ache of disappointment. I felt like a fool. I had mistaken his desperate need for comfort for something more. I had been a port in his storm, and now that the worst of it had passed, he had set sail again, leaving me alone on the shore. By the 5th day, the ache had curdled into a slow-burning anger. An anger at him for his cowardice, but also at myself for my own naivete. I could not live in this limbo, this purgatory of unspoken rejection. I needed to know. I needed to hear the words, even if they were the ones I dreaded. I needed him to look me in the eye and tell me what that kiss had been, so I could begin the painful process of moving on, of trying to salvage the wreckage of our friendship from the disaster of my hope. I went to his apartment. I stood outside his door for a full 5 minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs, my hand raised to knock, before I finally found the courage to do it. The sound echoed in the quiet, carpeted hallway. I heard movement inside, a pause, and then the sound of the lock turning. The door opened a few inches, and he was there, looking worse than he had the night he'd shown up at my place. He was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and he was still in a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants in the middle of a weekday afternoon. He looked haunted. "Leo," he said, his voice flat. He did not open the door further. "Are you going to let me in?" I asked, my own voice colder than I intended. He hesitated, then sighed and stepped back, opening the door. His apartment was a mess. Clothes were strewn over chairs. Takeout containers littered the coffee table. It looked like a place where someone had given up. He did not look at me, just walked back into the center of the living room and stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "What am I doing here?" I repeated, a bubble of incredulous laughter escaping my lips. "What do you think I'm doing here, Julian? You disappeared. After Saturday night, you just vanished. No explanation, just a series of pathetic, one-line texts. I thought you were my friend. I thought I at least deserved a conversation." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a miserable, panicked energy. "I know. I'm sorry. I've had a lot on my mind, don't, I said, cutting him off, my voice sharp. Don't you dare give me that generic nonsense. Not after everything. I have been your anchor for the past month. I have held your head while you slept. You kissed me, and then you ran away. You owe me more than a lot on my mind. He flinched as if I had struck him. He looked away, running a hand through his already messy hair. I know, he whispered. You're right. I'm sorry. That word, sorry, was a lit match tossed into a room full of gasoline. Sorry for what? I pressed, stepping closer to him, my anger fueled by weeks of anxiety and years of buried feelings. Are you sorry you kissed me? Is that it? Was it all just a big, confusing mistake for you? Was I just a convenient, warm body for you to cling to while you were sad about Chloe? Because you need to tell me, Julian. You need to tell me right now if that's all this was. He looked up, and for the first time, I saw not just panic in his eyes, but genuine fear. I don't know, he said, his voice cracking. Leo, I swear to God, I don't know. I don't feel this way. About guys. It's never been. Me. And then, with you. Everything has been so messed up in my head, and being at your place was the only time things felt quiet, felt right. And that night, I wasn't thinking. I felt something, and I acted on it, and it was a mistake. I crossed a line. I'm sorry I put you in that position. He had said it. A mistake. My heart, which had been bracing for the blow, still shattered. The pain was so sharp, so absolute, it stole the air from my lungs. All the anger drained out of me, leaving behind a cold, hollow emptiness. He was not just rejecting the kiss. He was rejecting the entire foundation of the intimacy we had built, reframing it as a symptom of his confusion, an unfortunate side effect of his own personal crisis. My feelings, my heart, my home, they were all just collateral damage. I looked at him, this man I had loved in silence for almost a decade, this man who had taken refuge in my life and was now trying to burn it down on his way out, and I felt a profound, desolate sadness. My friendship, I said, my voice dangerously quiet, was not a life raft. My home was not a halfway house for your broken heart. And my feelings are not a position you put me in. They are mine. I took a step back, needing to put space between us, the air around him suddenly feeling toxic. You're not just scared, Julian. You're a coward. And you've taken something that was good and clean and you've made it ugly. I did not wait for a reply. I turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind me. I walked down the hallway, through the lobby, and out into the indifferent city afternoon, feeling like the foundation of my entire world had just turned to dust beneath my feet. The earthquake was over. Now I just had to learn to live in the ruins. The week that followed was a lesson in the architecture of grief. I moved through my days like a ghost in my own life. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum, haunted by the memory of his presence. The indent on the couch where he used to lie seemed permanently etched into the fabric. Every corner held a memory. Every silence echoed with the ghost of his breathing. I tried to work, but the magic of the darkroom was gone. The images that emerged in the developer tray seemed flat and lifeless, great echoes of a world that had once been vibrant. I was adrift, unmoored from the one constant that had defined my adult life. The loss of the hope was painful, but the loss of the friendship was unbearable. It was a phantom limb, an ache for something that was no longer there. I tried to rebuild. I called old friends. I went to a gallery opening. I attempted to re-engage with the life I had before Julian's crisis had consumed mine. But it all felt like a pantomime, a hollow performance of being okay. I would smile and make conversation, but inside, I was listening for a footstep on the stairs, for the sound of a key in my lock that would never come again. I had built my world around him, a quiet satellite in orbit of his sun, and now, knocked from my trajectory, I was just spinning off into the cold, empty darkness. I understood, in a way I never had before, the empty silence he had described in his own apartment. Then, a week to the day after our confrontation, there was a knock on my door. It was late, past midnight. The sound was so soft I thought at first I had imagined it. Then it came again, a gentle, tentative tapping. My heart seized in my chest. I did not want to hope. Hope was a dangerous, sharp-edged thing that had only ever brought me pain. But I went to the door anyway. I opened it. My body braced for another disappointment, for a neighbor needing to borrow sugar, for anything but him. But it was him. He stood there in the dim hallway light, looking smaller than I had ever seen him, as if the week had physically diminished him. He looked like I felt. Exhausted. Broken. He was holding nothing, his hands hanging empty at his sides. He just stood there, looking at me, his eyes filled with a world of regret. We stood in silence for a long moment, the hum of the building's ancient refrigerator the only sound. I did not speak. I had said everything I needed to say. The next move had to be his. I was an idiot, he said finally, his voice thick, raw. I was a coward. Everything you said was true. He took a shaky breath. And I have been living in hell for the past 7 days. The silence in my apartment is nothing compared to the silence without you. He looked down at his feet, then back up at me, his gaze direct and pleading. I was so scared. Not of you. Not of what I felt. I was scared of myself. I was scared of what it meant. My whole life, I've had this. This script. College, job, girlfriend, wife. It was all laid out. I knew who I was supposed to be. And being with you, feeling what I felt with you. It didn't fit the script. It was real in a way that nothing else has ever been, and that terrified me. The safety, the peace I felt in your apartment. That wasn't about Chloe. That was about you. It's always been about you. He took a small, hesitant step forward. I ran away because admitting how I felt about you meant admitting that my entire life, the one I thought I wanted, was a lie. And I was too much of a coward to face that. So I hurt you instead. And it was the stupidest, most destructive thing I have ever done. He paused, his throat working. I miss you, Leo. I'm not sure I know how to exist without you. And if you'll let me, I want to try to be the man who is brave enough to deserve you. Not just as a friend. The words, honest and broken and true, dismantled the last of my defenses. The anger, the pain, the desolate sadness. It all just washed away, leaving behind the one thing that had been there all along, underneath everything else. My love for him. I saw the truth of his struggle, the terror of having your entire self-concept upended. I saw the man I had always known, lost and scared, finally finding his way home. I stepped back and opened my door wider. It was the only invitation he needed. There was no grand, cinematic reunion. There were no soaring declarations. There was just a quiet, profound sense of rightness. We talked for hours, sitting not on the couch, but at my small kitchen table, the harsh overhead light leaving no room for shadows or ambiguity. We unraveled the tangled knots of the past weeks and the past years. He talked about the subtle, persistent loneliness that had been the undercurrent of his life, the feeling of never quite being seen, even by the people who were supposed to love him most. And I, for the first time, spoke of the walls I had built, of the years I had spent loving him in silence, of the terror and hope that had warred within me. We laid all our broken pieces out on the table, and in the quiet honesty of that late-night confession, they began to fit together, forming something new, something whole. The new normal began that night. It was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual, gentle realignment. He stayed, and this time, when morning came, he was still there. I woke to the smell of coffee and found him in my kitchen, moving with a quiet, purposeful familiarity that made my heart ache with a new, peaceful kind of joy. He had not just come back to my apartment. He had come home. His things began to migrate from his place to mine, not in a single moving truck, but piece by piece, a slow, organic merging of two lives. A stack of his books appeared on my nightstand. His running shoes found a permanent spot by the door. His toothbrush stayed in the cup on the sink, no longer a temporary guest, but a resident. We learned a new language, one spoken in the daylight. It was a language of small, intentional gestures. The way his hand would find mine when we walked down the street. The way he would brush his thumb over my knuckles while we were reading in the same room. The way I would come up behind him while he was cooking and wrap my arms around his waist, resting my chin on his shoulder. Each touch was a quiet affirmation, a confirmation that this was real, that this was our new truth. The couch was still our place, but its meaning had transformed. It was no longer a space of agonizing ambiguity, but one of conscious, chosen intimacy. We would lie there, in the same configuration as that first night, his head in my lap, but now my fingers would be threaded through his hair, and his hand would be resting on my chest, right over my heart. The tension was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant peace. One rainy Sunday afternoon, I was in my darkroom, and he came in, moving carefully in the red-tinged gloom. He stood behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, and watched as I slipped a piece of photo paper into the developer. It was a picture I had taken of him a few days earlier, asleep in our bed, the morning light tracing the curve of his shoulder. We stood in silence, watching his image slowly, magically appear on the paper, emerging from the milky whiteness. It was a perfect, clear image, sharp and true. There was no fear of overexposing it, no danger of losing it in a chemical bath. It was just there, beautiful and permanent. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The thresholds of our past were no longer chasms to be feared, but foundations upon which we were building something new, something sturdy and real. The old maps were gone, but we did not need them anymore. We were learning to navigate by a new constellation, the one we had found in each other. The door to my apartment was no longer just an entrance to my sanctuary. It was the threshold to our home, a place where all the rooms were finally filled with a quiet, steady, and breathtaking light.